Digital 410 proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
What's up? Welcome to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, the music bed is extremely way too loud podcast. As always here at the Digital 410 Media, we're always constantly making adjustments to increase your audible experience. Speaking of audible experience, you hear his voice in your sleep. It's the warm sounding tones of Mr. Henry Sledge. Henry, how you doing today, sir? And as always, bringing the best experience possible, whether it's through audible or visual, museums or plastic airplanes hanging from your kid's ceiling, Mr. Jeff Copsetta. Jeff, how you doing tonight, sir?
That's a whole lot better of an intro. I appreciate that.
A whole lot better than the outro from... No, never mind. I was thinking about when I forgot to mention my brother on the other podcast. He got mad. We're doing the outro, and I was so burned. I went over him. But anyhow, how you guys doing? It's been a long day. Ooh, is this your first time laying down 2 episodes in a day? Well, with us, or I mean, in general? I mean, have you done other podcasts 2 at a time?
Never done that, no.
Yeah, well, see, you're moving up in the world. Jeff, how you been? How are things in Texas?
Well, I'd say they were hot, but it changed, so they're cold. But it's going to be hot again tomorrow. It's Texas in March.
Oh, I feel you. I've actually had my windows and doors open for the last 2 days. Like, oh, I can save money on AC. It was sweatshirt and hoodie in sock hat weather this morning. It was like 52 when I got up this morning. I was like, oh, it's cold.
Sick of cold weather.
When's the last time you had a good warm snap up there, Henry?
Week before last.
Oh, yeah. Just getting to sound like the old...
Awesome.
I'm tired of the heat. I enjoy cool weather.
I mean, last week, my son, it got cold again last week. Jack had a track meet, a mountain bike race, and then mountain bike practice yesterday. Froze my ass off.
Well, you know, and that's the thing that sucks nowadays with kids and sports. When we were kids, it was one baseball game. Your parents were out 2 hours on a Saturday, and that was it. Now, like, if you have kids playing volleyball, basketball, soccer, whatever, it's an all-day thing. And Jeff's...
Last week.
And I know Jeff's kids are getting to that age, too, where they've probably been playing organized sports where he's like, well, Saturday's gone. 4 hours with soccer and baseball.
I mean, it's a blessing, you know, as I'm sure Jeff would agree. But
for the kids, but as the parent who works 6 days a week, I just want my Saturday off. Lose the game.
Yeah,
Lose the game
that
so we can go home. So what's going on, Jeff? Give us an update on your world. I know you got a lot to talk about. We pulled your cord. We're going to let you take off like the Energizer Bunny of old. Not the computer version, but the old analog stuffed animal that they used to put on TV back when I was a kid.
Yeah, I got to make up for some lost ground. The listeners know I can't always be here, and it just kills me. And I have conversations with Henry about that. Like, man, y'all have a great one. I won't be there. Miss some amazing guests that y'all have on, but I appreciate y'all, working with me through that because, I do have a lot going on. But I will catch y'all up. I've got some really cool things to share. I was telling a few folks earlier today, like, oh, man, you having an episode tonight? Like, yes, but you may want to tune in and watch this one on YouTube because I have a lot of show and tell stuff. So
first and foremost, they should be tuning in to every episode, watching every episode on YouTube. But please go ahead.
I mean, absolutely, right? You never know what you're going to see. So, about a week ago, well, maybe a little longer ago than that, I got a real good friend of mine he's a combat medic, who's an active reservist stationed in Germany right now. He's in Ramstein. And he's just been traveling Europe, right? Just really enjoying the time he's got over there and the amount of time that he's got off, I guess, away from duty, really making the most of this deployment. So he sent me a message. He said, hey, dude, I'm sending you a package, but when it gets there, give me a call through Instagram or whatever. So he said, I got some things to explain. And I was like, oh, okay. Now, he's already sent one care package before, and it's been with, cookies and chocolates from different countries in Europe and just stuff for the kids and Tammy and everything, which was really cool. I mean, he's the guy that's overseas, and he's sending me care packages. Like, what a guy, right? So get this other package, and it's real tight. Let me just compact with, again, tins from Belgian wafers and chocolates from France and Germany and all cookies and all these sweets, package of cookies from Poland, and this amazing stuff. Then kind of down below all the tasty treats and goodies.
You need to find out what his favorite regional potato. Well, I guess you could get any of that on Amazon. I was gonna say you need to find out what his like favorite regional potato chips that he can't get overseas and like hook them up.
I keep asking him. I mean, he's going on the Band of Brothers tour with me. He already bought a ticket. I'm like, dude, I'll bring you something. He's like, I'm good. I don't need anything. Okay. I mean, obviously, I'm going to bring him something, but yeah, down under all these treats was like the real good stuff. So I'm pulling all this stuff out, and there's packets of papers and everything. Okay, this is probably why I need to call him. So I did, and he goes, okay, first things first. And I'm just going to kind of show you guys as I'm talking about it, but about a 6 to 8 inch length of old rusty barbed wire. And, you can imagine, okay, what World War I battlefield did this come off of is what I was first thinking. And you're absolutely right. He said, this is the wire from Verdun around the American defenses. Yeah.
Now, for the listening audience, are you kind of surprised at the lack amount of rust on that for how old it is?
It's actually not bad. I mean, I think part of it, I don't know if it was down in the ground. He didn't really go into that. But you're right. I mean, I think it's probably the quality of steel maybe or something, but I mean, it's still pretty durable. I mean, I'm not afraid to give it a little flex. I mean, some of the stuff you see is just kind of like snaps, that's it. So really cool there, some World War I history.
That's a type of artifact you got to put a disclaimer on your display. No touchy at pokey.
Right, exactly. Then there was a Ziploc bag with a little piece of paper and a map of what Stalag Luft 3 looked like, where all the buildings were, and the hospital. There was a coal store, and then the cooler, right? And of course, if anybody's seen The Great Escape, you can picture Steve McQueen, the Cooler King, right? He was always getting sent to the cooler, and he's sitting in there with his old ball mitt, and he's bouncing the baseball off the wall in the cooler. This is a big rock, chunk of concrete that came from the cooler on Stalag Luft 3. So I can only imagine what this wall, what this rock saw, and how many of those guys were, put in there for days on end. It's surprisingly light. It's almost like
when you're holding it up to the camera, it looks like a small chunk, but as you rotate it away and we can see the size in contrast with your fingers, you realize it's a pretty good chunk. I'd say it's about the size of a playing card, a little bit bigger.
Yeah, about that. Maybe not quite as long.
As thick as the entire deck.
Yeah, about the size of the thickness of a deck of cards. You're right. That's a pretty good analogy. Yeah, and there's one side that's much darker than the other, so I'm assuming that darker side was probably what was exposed on the inside of the cooler there. It's got some black mark on it. I really tried to look to see if there was any kind of etching or tally marks or anything. I didn't really see anything on there. So that was just like, wow, this is really cool, dude. Then the really good stuff showed up, right? And so as I'm talking through this, he says, okay, you pull this packet out. I'm like, okay. So there was this big packet, and he's got some color pictures. And what he did was he sent me samples of soil from 18 different battlefields in Europe.
Then a bunch of blank documents that said, fill out these soil reports so I can submit them at work and get my job done.
Right. So the packet goes along with the order. So there's a vial mark number 1, a vial mark number 2. So he said if you stack 1 on top of 2 and start at the top, that's the order of how it appears in the packet. And this is all stuff he did on his own, right? Not only does he give me
not only does he collect all this stuff, but he spends like 3.5 weeks of his own personal time cataloging and distributing it to you.
Oh, I know. I mean, this guy's incredible. So, yeah, not only does he give you a little, synopsis of the battle, he goes, just in case there were some, he said there was places I'd never really heard of. So I said, I gave you a little synopsis of the battle. I gave you a YouTube link. But to me, I thought the coolest thing was he gave me GPS coordinates.
Oh, that's sweet.
To exactly where the sample came from. So he said, you can look at that. If you want to look at a map of the battle and see exactly where this dirt come from. So just to give you an example, I'm not going to read all of these, but to give you an example of some of these places. So Belleau Wood, right? Every Marine just perked up. Battle of Aricourt, Lorraine Campaign, Herdgen Forest. Let's see, Bastogne, of course, the Blajac and what was a shell hole or a foxhole. Fight at the Crossroads. We know the Crossroads pretty well if you've seen Band of Brothers. Let's see, Blue Beach, Dieppe. My gosh, I mean, it just goes on and on. There was one, I can't remember where it was. There's a Battle for Hill 223, Sergeant Alvin York. I want to say there was one from the Gaelic Wars too. Here we go. Battle of Alasia, September 52 BC. 12 Roman legions with cavalry and auxiliaries. This soil is from the site of a failed final charge against Caesar's ring of fortifications from 52 BC. So, this guy, I've known him for years now. We met reenacting, and he's just always just bent over backwards. He's a heck of a reenactor. But let me tell you, I wish everybody had a friend like I have a friend in
Tell me
Staff
about
Sergeant
it.
Purrs.
I ain't got no dirt.
Man, I mean, what a guy. What a guy to send me all of this. So I wanted to give him a shout out. Like I said, he's serving this great nation in uniform in Germany. And while he may not have the most stressful time over there, it looks like he's certainly making the most of his time. And he literally sent me a message, said, whatever you need for content for What's the Scuttlebutt. He said, look, I've been to these places so many times.
Awesome.
If you've got a listener that's wanting to travel, he said, I am at your disposal. I can tell you all the best places to eat, where to stay, where to go, and how not to waste your time navigating through Europe and all these battlefields in history. So,
well, this would be a
well
nice
done.
little segue. We didn't really mention it at the top of the show for you guys watching on YouTube and those of you listening to this show tomorrow. Stick around for part 2. Me and Henry sat down with Saul David, but the reason that I bring this up, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this as an IT guy, maybe it's because I'm so burnt out on computers when I get home and I want nothing to do with them. But Henry was explaining to me, this is so simple, but I feel so dumb that I never even crossed my mind to do this. And this would be great for your coordinates. He gave you the coordinates for your dirt. Henry's like, yeah, when I read these books, I just go on Google Maps and look at the battlefields. I'm like, I never thought of that. So it'd be perfect. Like, you could put those coordinates on Google Maps and zoom in and see exactly what the area looks like.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, man. I mean, Herdgen Forest. Herdgen Forest is one of my favorite battles of Europe. I haven't read anything on it this past winter, but I wanted to hear more about your soil from Herdgen Forest. I'd like to know exactly where it was.
Yeah,
but I don't want to interrupt what
that.
Don was saying. I mean,
well, we're going to get back to the soil here in a minute. And as we're talking about later on, is a lot of these battlefields have now been, developed. But even the ones that haven't, if they have a good road going through it, you can get down at the road level thanks to the Google car and actually
Street View
and spin around 360. So Jeff should definitely do that with his soil reports. Out of all those soils he sent you, which one got the hair standing up on you a little bit more than the others? Obviously, you're excited about all of them, but every collection, even a micro collection, there's got to be a favorite of the group.
Yeah, I mean, it was really not a Marine, but I mean, Belleau Wood.
Yeah,
that's pretty amazing to see that. And I'll be honest, I think the sands from Dunkirk really impressed me because you can actually see little bits of seashells down in there. You can kind of spin these vials sideways and really kind of get a good surface area to see what's inside of them. And it's really interesting. It's gonna be hard to tell on this camera, but it's really interesting to see the colors, the grains. I mean, there's whites, tans, oranges, browns, burnt yellow color.
You should take
black.
those to work and head down to the science department, throw some of those on a slide, look under a microscope, check them out.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, anyway, heck of it, dude. Just thanks a lot, buddy. I'm gonna see you here in a couple months. That was a really cool surprise. It came at the beginning of my spring break and then the end of my spring break, which we just celebrated this past week. We have an early spring break here in Texas. The air show, 31st annual air show. It was the first air show in the 2023 season. And, so we're kind of used to that. We kick off the air show season, in the U.S., but it was also the first one since the fateful air show
Oh,
at
yes.
Wings over Dallas. And
Especially the home state.
yeah, we, for being a small, smaller hangar, smaller museum, smaller squadron, the pressure was really on, and the microscope was really zooming in on us. And there was a time, less than 2 weeks before the air show started, where we were not approved by FAA to have an air show. And we really started scrambling through a 1,000-page document to make sure that this waiver could get approved. And the emergency safety plan was put into effect. And all day Friday, we're running scenarios with EMS, fire, police, running down the runway, sirens on, the whole drill. And when all was said and done, the FAA, of course, they were there, inspectors were there through the whole pilot briefing, all the way through the end of the show. And they said, we have set the bar for air shows now, which was just such a huge pat on the back. Early attendance numbers, and who cares about that, right? If you had one 8-year-old kid that loves airplanes and come, that's a success, right? But, when you look at the attendance, it was the second highest ever attended. It was going to be hard to break last year's record. But last year it was like 75 degrees and perfection. This year was 52 degrees, but it started off in the high 30s, overcast. Not the best day to stand outside.
No, but as somebody wearing wool and a leather jacket, you're like, it's beautiful out.
I know. Yeah, it's perfect for us, right? Living history. I said the same thing. Like, man, I'll be fine in my A2.
Yeah.
But, with that said, for folks who may not realize this, we have a lot of the stunt aircraft, too. It's not just old World War II warbirds flying left to right. We have a lot of those stunts that they got the smoke generators on, and they're doing hammerheads and triple snap rolls and everything. And cooler, thinner air definitely helps the aircraft perform a lot better than if it was 100 degrees and humid. So from that perspective, and of course, overcast skies, but a high ceiling, like 7,500 feet, something like that. So it's a perfect white backdrop for every picture taken in the air, no direct sunlight for us. So that part was a success. And, to be able to, I had time to take one picture, right? Because, I'm running all the ground acts and everything else. But I got to take a picture with one of my favorite World War II veterans that I've ever met, Colonel Joe McPhail. He flew with VMF 323 off Okinawa, flew Corsairs. I know Henry's digging that. VMF 323, where they were called the Death Rattlers.
Man, I love the Death Rattlers.
And then flew in
Heavy
Korea.
Okinawa.
Right. And then flew in Korea, combat in Korea, with none other than VMF 214, Baba Black Sheep in Korea. So, yeah, he also flew Wildcats and the F9s. So, just a heck of a guy. If y'all go on the Instagram and see the picture of him and I, the man looks great. We're joking around. He always remembers me. He's 102 years old. And he's coming from 5 hours away. And just to talk to him and his son was telling me, guys, this is incredible. They are putting a huge dedication to Colonel McPhail together.
Nice.
At the Oshkosh Air Show. I think it's the last weekend in July, right? Largest air show in the world, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. They have 18 airworthy Corsairs flying in from all over the place.
Could you imagine the sound of that waving over your head?
When is that going to be?
I think it's the last weekend in July. You just look up the Oshkosh Air Show. Like I said, it's the largest one in the country. I think at one air show they had about 10,000 aircraft there at one time.
Hey,
for the
is there any? Could I get one of those photos you've got of him? I mean, I know he couldn't sign it, but I'd love to get that photograph of him standing there in his flight gear. Is there any way I can get one of those?
I'll email him. I'll get on
I mean,
that.
if I got if there's a cost or something like that, let me know what it is. I mean, I'm not going to get crazy or anything, but
right. No, don't worry about that. We'll take care of that. Yeah, I wish I'd have known a couple days sooner. I'd have grabbed another one. I actually got this a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And so I just have the one that's usually hanging on the wall. But this time I was like, okay, you know what? I've got a couple books about Corsairs. My dad has a nice book about Corsairs. I said, hey, can you sign a couple pages in here too? not
I
just
like that picture, man.
Yeah, it's a great shot of him on Okie. Heck of a guy. Then, and I got one more thing I really wanted to talk about. And this one really is going to take the cake because I don't think you guys even know about this yet. So y'all know I had this buddy in Japan
Mm-hmm.
who he's a reenactor, but he does a lot of other things, works for the government over there. He comes to America every year. He hasn't been able to since COVID started, so it's been a few years since I've seen him. And we talk, I'd probably say weekly. Facebook Messenger is a great thing when you have a 12-hour time difference, whatever Japan
Absolutely.
is from here, right? So it's cool. We get to stay in touch and share ideas back and forth. Well, he came over with one of his other or two of his other colleagues, I should say, and to see Yoshiro in this little museum in Burnet, Texas, was just like amazing, right? And he came early enough, came about 2 hours before the air show started. Gates were open to the public, but we're just kind of milling around. 40s music's playing. We're just the whole setting up thing. Airplanes are coming in, getting ready. So I had a little bit of time to visit with him. And he said, I have something for you. And I said, oh, you sure? You don't have to do that. He goes, no. And so he said, look, and I don't have this written down yet, so I may misspeak, but this is how I understood the story. The Sasebo Naval Base. I think you guys have probably heard of Sasebo.
Yeah.
Okay. Their flags that flew at like Kure and Sasebo, he said the flags that flew there were of a different material than probably the flags that flew on just some of the islands that the grunts would put up, right? They didn't have the resources that we had.
So were they a thicker canvas?
Yeah, I think they were thicker, probably more durable, maybe put some more time into the embroidery, whatever it was. But so, like I said, I had a little bit of a hard time understanding, but that's from what I gathered. So all of the veterans from Sasebo are no longer around. And there was a woman who was kind of the curator for this artifact, was very specific as to where this artifact was going to end up. And Yoshiro says, I have somebody, in America that I would like to present it to. Man, I'm sorry. It's just overwhelming to be given this. And I'll share pictures and, like I said, in a story when I get it. But here you go. The way I understand it, this flew over Sasebo during World War II.
Wow. And for those of you listening, this is not an American flag. It's obviously the Japanese rising sun flag. That's beautiful. You don't see a lot of those. Most of the Japanese flags you see are just the red ball in the middle. You don't see a whole lot of rising sun flags. So that's even cooler. That's beautiful. Congratulations on that.
Yeah,
So what's your thinking on display? You going to do shadow box, full frame, glass?
Yeah, absolutely.
Completely
and
open?
I told him that. I said, you need to send me everything you just told me so I can build a proper display, because like I said, the way I understood it, this was the one that the veterans were, it was in their care. And once all the veterans were gone, it was in somebody else's care. And Yoshiro said, I wanted to go here. I'm just so honored to have it. I was just speechless. So yeah, what an awesome piece of history. And, and I think I shared the story with you guys on the air before too. Yoshiro was the one that he helped me translate a letter.
Yes.
Yes. So, and that's in a box and hanging, in the museum now. And I've got another flag, like you said, just to hear Maru in the middle, but it's got a bunch of signatures on it from a lot of the guys, all in Japanese. And Yoshiro he actually helped me pick out a few things on that too. So that's hanging above it as well. But this one, I'm not sure, if this is something I want to do permanent display or maybe, a temporary exhibit type thing, and rotate out every now and then. I'm not sure exactly how I want to do that, but just, the stuff that comes across our desk is just unbelievable. So I'm gonna take a sip of some Warbird coffee and I'll let y'all talk for a few minutes.
Well, real quick, get that email that I sent you earlier, because Mr. DJ Bowen is actually hanging out in the YouTube chat right now. And we were talking about this gentleman before the show. He has quickly become, I would say, one of the more apparent. I'm not going to say, we have a lot of listeners who, listen, dedicated. They're dedicated and they listen a lot, but he sends us emails. He comments on our Instagram. He comments on Facebook pages. He shows up on Patreon, and his name just keeps popping up. And so he's quickly climbed the rank as the most visual WTSP listener. Primarily, don't want to take anything from Gabriel, but he's away at boot camp and joined the Navy, so he doesn't have access to all the interfaces that he once did. And so, but DJ, we want to thank you for your support and all the things you do to help us out here and your communication. And we also want to hear from the rest of you guys. So now if you're feeling offended, like I want to take this DJ guy down a peg, you can start by mailing us at mailcallwtspworldwar2.com. That's WTSPWWII.com. But on this week's episode of Mail Call, take it away, Jeff.
All right. Yeah. So, DJ, awesome, man. This is so nice to hear from you. So, great episode Monday. I read Heart of Hell, and what a book. Very emotional book. Really can connect with the people. And to go through the Iwo Jima battle with them, it's actually quite emotional. Was glad to hear Dennis back on the show, switching to the topic of movie scenes that really grab you. I have one to share. It's not a combat scene. In the movie The Fighting Sullivans, the 5 boys were portrayed climbing a water tower to wave goodbye to their dad on his way off to work on a train when they were kids. At the end of the movie, after the family is informed of their deaths, the dad hears the train whistle and says he's never been late in X amount of years, and he's not going to start now. The scene for me is he is on the train heading out, and he's passing that water tower. He looks up, sees it's empty, and just salutes. The look on his face and eyes just sticks with me. I do not know if the scene is actually that good, or if it's my own feelings connecting with it. I grew up watching the movie with my granddad, who I was so close to. He passed away when I was 9, so the father seeing that empty tower just reminds me of the emptiness of watching it without my grandfather. Little bias there, I guess. Side note, Rogue Heroes, the show was great, the book even better. So much so, I had to read his other book, Prisoners of the Castle, about the German POW camp in Colditz. I think Henry has mentioned it, and it too is a wonderful read. Keep up the great content, DJ.
Jeff, have you gotten around to watching Rogue Heroes yet?
Yeah, I know. I wish I have not. The only thing I've watched here recently, after receiving this package from Pers, was I watched The Great Escape again.
Nice.
It's been a while. Yeah. But since we're doing shout outs and you mentioned Gabe, I do want to report that Gabe has successfully completed basic training. I think I got that text the morning of the air show.
He sent me a message too.
Okay, good. Yeah, so he's about to enter the new realm of active duty Navy, and Don Henry, it finally happened to me. You guys have experienced this before, but I think I had opened the air show. I want to say I did the first ground act maybe, or right before that. So I'm running around crazy like a chicken without my head, and a guy comes up to me. 2 guys come up to me. And they go up and shake my hand. They said, Jeff? And I said, yeah. And they said, man, we love the podcast.
Fantastic. Love to hear that.
This is awesome. So his name was Connor from Austin. He said he's been listening since 2021.
Nice.
Loves what we're doing. So, Connor, if you're listening, thanks for coming up to me and shaking my hand. It really means a lot to us when we have listeners come up.
It does.
And tell us in person that they love the show. So, all right, go ahead, Don. What do you got there?
What do you guys think? I don't do Navy. I came across this. I think we should send this to Gabe. What do you think? As a graduation present, it's a authentic, original World War II era Navy blue cap.
I think he would appreciate that very much. So, yeah, let me know what we need to do.
Just got to get his address. He sent me a message too. So yeah, I'll reach out to him, get his address, and we'll get this in the mail to him because it's it's just kind of out of place here. And I think I like the idea of somebody who is in his hobby as much as we are and who loves to build impressions and collect artifacts. And the fact that he just finished up Navy boot camp, I think it'd be great on behalf of us here at What's the Scuttlebutt to send that out his way.
Man, I honestly, I think you should just deliver it to him in Pensacola.
Yeah, I could do that.
I
It's a bit
mean,
of a drive.
just saying.
Yeah, I mean, if I make it that far, I might as well just keep driving north to go say hi to Henry.
There you go.
And then at that point, I might as well just head west and just put a little north into it and head out that way to see you.
So isn't Gabe doing? He's doing something with ordnance, right? He's gonna be an ordnanceman,
Believe so.
if I remember. I mean, it'd be really cool to send him a couple WTSP stickers and see if they end up on the side of some 1,000-pound bomb under some
Instead of chalk.
jet on a carrier somewhere.
Oh, that would be awesome. I have a friend of mine who was in the Army in the 70s and 80s. Then he did EOD, and then he went on to do weapons development and testing for the Navy. And, well, not just for the Navy, but all the forces. And he has, on the back of his house, are hung up, they're probably 4.5-inch thick steel plates that they shot large-ass rounds of miscellaneous, ammo through. And they just leave this beautiful, big spillage open stretched, and they're just mounted on the backside of his house. Every time I see one, I'm like, that's a big-ass round. I mean, these are like 8-inch holes that just melted in this aluminum. I don't know what high velocity. These things were huge, but it's just so cool to see him, because he's had them for years. Like, well, just put them on the back of my house in Florida. It's like perfect.
Wow.
That's great. Oh, boy.
That reminds me of a little project I was involved in when I was still active. There was a guy that was trying to basically sell this bulletproof glass to the government.
Okay.
And this is at the start of the war. This is actually before I deployed, so this would have been like 02, 03. And give me a second. I've got an example of it here, but
Sure.
it was interesting because it's real thick, but it doesn't distort anything behind it, right? You reach a certain thickness and you see it's wavy or whatever.
Well, yeah, because they usually put sheets of like a rubbery plastic in between the layers, and that has some effect on the transparency, especially after it takes a round. But
right, and that's what was so neat about this. So this was, I mean, it's thick, but I mean, it's just like looking through a single pane glass window. So it would have been perfect for like windshields for Humvees. And of course, this is before all the up armored stuff came out, and it was taken care of. So the deal kind of flopped. But I spent all day taking every caliber round you could think of with a shield and eye protection and literally walking up to the stuff point blank.
wow.
And firing it. So yeah, I'll give you an example here in just a second. This was I think it was a 44 Magnum hitting
Nice.
this thing. Yeah.
You should see what a 30-06 from an M1 Garand does to a computer hard drive from 70 yards away. It puts a nice big hole in the back of him. And he's back already with a quickness.
Yeah, so this makes a cool like conversation paperweight on your desk.
Yeah, oh yeah. Still got the round in it. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it's just all mushroomed out. So the thickness is, I mean,
Yep.
I don't know, not quite 2 inches, but the thickness of where the bullet, went in is, barely 1/8 of an inch, and you can see there's some damage inside, but it's perfect on the back, and I mean, you can see how clear it is where it's not damaged.
You can see where the force.
Look, you can read my T-shirt through it.
Yeah, and you can see where the inertia was basically captured and it just stopped.
Yeah. Stop.
It's insane.
Yeah. So this is pretty cool to have on the desk there, but yeah, that just kind of reminded me of that.
We were talking about the flag that you got as a beautiful gift earlier, and I had a thought. Do either one of you, I'm sure Jeff probably has 3 or 4 of them, but you guys both have 48-star American flags, right?
I do. Yeah, I do. It's actually in the archives at Auburn. But I do, yeah.
Looking at those original flags, it makes you realize, and obviously we don't have them nowadays because the majority, if not all of our flags are synthetic, but the reason they had flag codes back in the day, the whole not supposed to keep it out in the rain, not supposed to keep it out dark, it's just because that material would just quickly get so beaten up because it was just basically heavy canvas.
Yeah.
Cotton and whatever twines they had of the day. But mine actually came from my grandmother, and the funny story behind it was she was a Boy Scout, because she had 3 daughters. Girl Scout leader, and she had a 48-star flag because that's how many states we had at the time. And then when we brought into the state 40. Actually, no. Then I think it quickly jumped to the 50th because we brought in 2 more states almost right away. Then there was never really a 49-star flag. And so by the time she was getting really into the scout leading, we had 50 states, but she couldn't afford a new flag. And so she always felt kind of, guilty for still having a 48-star flag, flying at their scout leading things. But she just, the money there for a flag that large. And so I have it here. I have it put away, but it's kind of cool to see 48-star flags like that.
One, as you were saying that, Don, I just remembered the story on the one that I had and my dad had. So my grandfather was a doctor in the National Guard in World War I. Okay. Now he was not in Europe, but he was for quite a long time in Plattsburgh, New York. And this flag that we had, it's huge, right? I mean, it's like the size of the wall in your bedroom.
Yeah.
It flew over that base, I believe. Probably over the hospital or something where he would have been, obviously, as a doctor. But I think I remember my mom telling me that. So, and it's like it's kind of beat up. You could tell it's beat up by the wind and all. But
I have a couple 48 stars. I actually would love to get a Betsy Ross flag just to put out for 4th of July. I keep one out here, lit up at night. But I have of course, not a 48-star flag. It's a 50-star flag. But I was tasked one day when we were in Baghdad. It's a huge cardboard box, and the colonel comes out with it and tells, just put it in the back of that truck there. I'm like, pointing it at my Humvee. I'm like, what the heck? We don't have room for some huge cardboard box. What the heck is that? And it was a box of flags. Nice. It was literally just a box of flags sent over, and I forget the organization, and they just wanted to say they had a little certificate made up to say that this flag was on a combat patrol, in Iraq. And I was like, well, that's cool, but will we get one? I'd like to kind of have one. And lo and behold, all of us in the truck got to have one. That's the one I keep. It's folded over the fireplace, in the living room there. But really cool little certificate. And I thought about it then, and it makes me think about what you guys are saying now. It's nothing. But, 50, 100 years from now, maybe my grandkids are like, hey, this old 50-star flag, my great-grandpa had on a combat, patrol in Baghdad,
yeah.
we could only hope.
I always find the dumbest things funny, and it always brings a giggle to me when I drive up. I know this is a worldwide podcast, but we're going to get a real regional. As I drive up the 6-lane thoroughfare that is known as Pine Island, on one side you have a Jeep dealership. Got all the Jeeps out there, all the American cars. Got a big-ass American flag. On the other side is a Nissan dealership whose American flag is a little bit bigger. It's like, Nissan's like,
they've got the biggest.
Hold our sake. We're going to fly a big-ass American flag to make the Dodge dealer look, it's like, come on, Dodge. You got to get a bigger flag out there. You can't let the Japanese dealership across the road have the bigger American flag. You got to take it back. You're going to have all your Jeeps out there with the white stars on it trying to look like Willys. You got to get the bigger flag. You got to put the bigger flag up.
Someday in the future, somebody may see that massive flag and go, what incredible piece of history is this? I flew over Jim Skinner Ford in downtown,
Well, I'd be curious to see what the dimensions are, because the Dodge dealership, which is right across the street from our hangar, I used to work there right out of high school. That flag is 30 by 50.
Yeah, I believe it, man.
And I mean, it is a tough cotton. I remember having to change it one year. It took 4 of us just to get it out of the box. And there was one, and he was a pretty good-sized boy hanging on to it, keeping it, a couple of us keep it off the ground. And as it was going up, he was hanging on to it. He got lifted up and over a Dodge Neon and came back down. But it is a huge flag.
It's funny, in Grove City where I grew up, the Denny's of all places had a huge flag, probably as big as one, maybe a little bit bigger. And they had a deal struck up with the high school's ROTC and marching band. They would allow them to use that flag during the football halftime shows in exchange for the high school would pay to keep the upkeep on the flag. Because once again, it's not nylon, it's this heavy canvas, but it would take a whooping. And so our school would pay to maintain that flag. And this thing was just, it looked great out on the football field. But yeah, I could not imagine trying to do the giant football fold on that thing. It's like, we need 2 4-wheelers and a protractor. Yeah, I mean, it's...
Can I throw something in on the flag bit?
Yep.
So, being March 2023, so This is the only flag I've got. This is Eugene Sledge's funeral flag.
Wow.
And that was earlier this month, in 2001.
That's
I don't know
beautiful.
why I didn't think to mention that.
Wow.
At some point in the past, March 3rd, but his funeral, I think, was like the 5th or 6th of 01.
Jeez.
But, that thing, I mean, Jeff, I'm sure you've seen it done many times, still got the rounds, like the Marine when they were folding it up. That kid
Duty,
looked like he
honor,
couldn't have been.
country.
Okay, yeah, he took, because he was right in front of me when he did it. And I swear I think this kid was crying. He couldn't have been 17. And he took those rounds and stuck them in there when he folded it. I'll always remember that.
Yeah. That's awesome.
But back to dealership flags. Didn't mean to change the mood there.
What's up, Mike Miller? Checking in on YouTube. Thanks for checking in. And DJ came back, said, love the show. Keep up and he's actually up to watch. Usually we're a little late for him. He's got to hit the early snooze button. But
hey, tell DJ that
Henry,
Ben McIntyre.
I don't know if you'll know how the internet works, but he can hear you. So go ahead, you can tell him.
Hey, you know what? I'll just forget my comment.
No,
you
please
guys
tell
keep
him.
talking.
Please tell him. I want you to tell him. I don't need to tell him.
I'm sorry.
You can tell him.
So DJ, I did email Ben McIntyre to come on the show, who wrote Rogue Heroes and who wrote Prisoners of the Castle, and he says his current publisher won't allow him to any more obligations. So unfortunately, but he did remember meeting me in New Orleans. He sent a very kind reply. Said he enjoyed meeting me in New Orleans back in November at the international conference. But I was hoping I could get Ben to come on the show.
The DJ's laughing his ass off in the YouTube channel right now. See, unfortunately, the internet isn't a way where you could get the message back unless you were to log into YouTube right now too. But yeah. Wait a minute, Mark Miller came back. I was born in South Korea, Seoul, Korea. Well, fantastic, Mike.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, it's a puppy. It's a puppy.
Easy moose.
Everything comes to a screeching halt when there's a puppy on the show. Look at that puppy.
He's getting bigger.
Go ahead, Henry. Say it. You always say something when there's a dog on the screen. Has something.
Oh, goodness, and I look at that puppy dog.
No, you say something about stinky breath or something every time.
It's our dogs.
Man, so
what's harder?
Yeah,
because you still have some that are youngins, puppy or babies.
both. Man, I was just thinking that.
At least the baby don't chew your shoes.
Yeah, but it's the baby's shoes because they leave them around and then the dog gets them. It's like this vicious circle. Yeah, it kind of reminds me. So happy birthday to our buddy Matthew Leach. Everybody knows him as First Sergeant Floyd Talbot, Band of Brothers. I have accepted the challenge. Apparently, this guy has like more energy than anybody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Henry, maybe you can attest to this. I don't know, but everybody's like, "Oh yeah, you can't keep up with." Okay, well, we're gonna see. I tell him challenge accepted when I get there in June, because if I can keep up with 4 kiddos and a puppy and haven't slept in like probably like a normal full night of sleep like a human should get probably like 20 years. I'm a high school teacher running a museum, a board of directors for the library, hanging out with you guys, still reading books. Bring it on, Mr. Leach. Bring it on. I can't wait to see what this guy's got.
He's supposed to schlep you all over the.
We shall see. We shall see.
Excited to see what happens there. Hopefully he leaves you in the dust since you just like threw down the gauntlet.
We'll see who drops first. Because man, this puppy. Yeah. Anyway,
you're gonna land, get off the plane.
Puppy.
He's gonna walk up, and smack you with an airborne glove, and said he demands satisfaction. He's gonna challenge you to a physical walkathon duel. 20 miles at dawn, sir.
Well, I remember when the first time I went to New Orleans in the World War II Museum, it's like a couples weekend.
No.
So yeah, me and Tammy, another good friend of mine, and his wife, and they live in San Antonio, so we went there to their place first, and we were gonna leave in the morning, and we had a beautiful room at the, oh gosh, I can't think of the name of the hotel now.
The Higgins.
No, it was Maison Dupuis. Because they dump the rates. Any other time of year, I wouldn't spend that kind of money to fall asleep. But in November, they make it somewhat affordable for normal people. And beautiful hotel, right? I don't know. It's usually probably 500 a night, something like that, and we got it for way less. So, yeah, we're just up talking. It was like 9, 10 o'clock, and we were just talking about how excited we were to get there. And I was like, "Why don't we just go?" And they're like, "What do you mean? Like, let's just go now." Like, drive through the night? I'm like, "Yeah, I'll drive. I'm driving anyway. I'll drive through the night." Drove through the night, got there, had a hand grenade for breakfast. If y'all have been there and you know what that is.
Well, we all know that Jeff actually has a coffee pot that he puts in the console of his truck when he drives across the country.
You saw that, didn't you?
Stacked full of Warbird coffee, and he's just hitting the road. White line
Warbird
fever.
I'll tell you, I wish I had Warbird coffee then because, man, this stuff, let me tell you, if you guys get you some Warbird and you get the EP-146, they got their little horsepower marks down here. It's like kills on the side of an airplane, right?
Get your prop spinning, does it?
This one's like you're in a negative 3G dive inverted. This one's so hyped up. This is 5 out of 5. Yeah, yeah, that was a Top Gun reference. Yeah, get you some Warbird because if you're tired, you won't be.
Henry, what you reading?
Battle of the Bismarck Sea by Michael Veitch. I finished Red Scorpion by Pete Saskin, and I just started Battle of the Bismarck Sea by Michael Veitch. And he's written a couple other books on the New Guinea. He's Australian, and I came by him. I came to be aware of who he was from watching World War II TV, Paul Woodadge, but he's done a lot of writing on the New Guinea fighting. So in that aspect of the Pacific War fascinates me. So, yeah, I started that, and then he wrote another book on Milne Bay that I want to read after this one.
Jeffrey?
With the old breed.
I didn't get a chance to ask the
Eugene
question.
Sledge.
Everybody waits. They repeat it in their car. It's become a thing. Everybody wants the thing. Hey, Jeff, what you reading?
Okay, I am reading With the Old Breed by one and only Mr. E.B. Sledge. Henry's father, everybody's hero, and it's just better. It's even better than the first time I read it.
Thank you,
It's
Jeff.
incredible. And
It's like spaghetti. It's better the second time through.
you could say that. You could say that. But at a certain point, I think spaghetti starts taking a nosedive, and I think With the Old Breed will just keep doing this forever.
Is there
I'm at the
something you
part-
picked up on your second read through that you passed over? Because we said before, this is one of those
Yes.
books that you pick up on so many little things, especially after becoming more familiar with the subject matter and perhaps watching the show second or third time through. What's something that just, how did I miss that the first time?
Yes, and I was just going to talk about there was a certain thing, but I'll be honest, reading that. So when I read it the first time, I had, not that this means anything. Hang on, screaming baby in the background. But I had zero college education the first time I read it. Like I said, that doesn't mean I'm any smarter now. It's just I look for, I guess, maybe certain things I pick up on. So it's more the tone and how it's written is what I picked up on the most. And like I think I mentioned this before, like just the first sentence of the first page really kind of, this is matter of fact. This is it. This is the cold hard steel. It's it. This is not a literary masterpiece with assimilation. This is words that are very strategic, and it's not overdone. So I picked up on that from the first sentence of the first page of the first chapter, and understanding it written that way has really helped. Of course, knowing Henry now for a little while definitely gives a more intimate look. But here is the biggest thing I didn't realize. And I think it's just condensed when we watch Pacific because we think that's accurate, right? But I think I had no idea. So the scene where your father and let's see, Bergie and I guess Snafu, one or two other guys,
Layden.
is on the pill box. Layden, I guess, was there on the pillbox where they thought it was already clear, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thought that was Peleliu.
Yeah.
Thought that was on Peleliu, right?
Maybe you weren't on that episode. We were talking about that exact thing about how in the Pacific they made it look like that was just walking through Peleliu. Oh, there's a bunker over there. It was completely involved a different landing.
I know we've talked about this, or
Yeah.
I'll tell you again that when the conversation I had with Bruce McKenna, because he called me before they were going to film that. I mean, Jeff, do you want me to repeat that, or?
Yeah, we get new listeners all the time.
Yeah,
So
go ahead,
please.
because I would love for you to say the name of the island first too before I.
Yeah, sure. So
I
where that
slaughtered
actually
all
occurred,
those.
there was this little island just to the north across a causeway called Ingusibus, or Nicosibus, or Netibus, as people in Palau pronounce it, but I've always just called it Ingusibus. But it was
The
determined that we
vocabulary
needed that.
word of the day is Ingusibus.
Yeah. So it was determined we needed it because for two reasons: for the fighter field that was on it, and then also to prevent the Japanese coming down from the northern Palau Islands from landing there and then jumping across to reinforce the garrison on Peleliu. So D+13, September 28th, they went across. It was only 3rd Battalion who went across. Nobody, I think, the other regiments did not go across. The other battalions of the 5th Marines, I think it was just 3rd Battalion. But I remember Bruce calling me before they shot that episode, before they shot that scene at the bunker, where, as it is in the book, the Japanese soldier comes up in the mouth of the pillbox after the Amtrak fired 3 point-blank rounds into it, and he tries to get a grenade off, and my dad's the first one with his carbine and starts shooting him. And Bruce told me, he said that the director's concerned because at this point in the show, we've already seen, X number of hours of shooting and killing and gratuitous violence. So we really want that scene to have maximum impact. So he wants to have your dad kill the guy with a bayonet. And of course, that was a separate conversation. That's going down a rabbit hole. But I asked him, he said, yeah, we're going to have that like it's on East Road, part of Peleliu. And I said, well, but it was on Ingusibus. I mean, are we not going to have another little landing scene? He said, man, look, every time they fire up those LVTs, the budget just goes, it is astronomical to fire those machines.
Gas, insurance, everything.
Everything. So he said, we're just folding that into, and hey guys, I mean, that was my introduction to the hard world of budgetary management, character compression, scene compression, all these things that we talk about because we love World War II movies, but we know they do these things, and I kind of was beginning to understand that there.
And then they went and gave him a damn Thompson.
Well, no, he, what do you mean?
In the movie, he didn't have a carbine. He had a Thompson in the TV show.
Well, no, on Ingusibus he had a carbine. And then later he and Snafu started sharing a Thompson. That is true.
Okay, I have to look because I thought in that scene he sprayed the Japanese who ran out of the bunker towards him. I thought in the movie they gave him a Thompson instead of the carbine.
No, actually he picks up, I think it's an M1.
I'll have to go back and look.
Because remember that he's lying there with Bill Layden,
yep.
And that's where they did a little artistic license, and we had some conversations about that. And I don't want to just bore you guys with stuff I've already talked about, but
I don't think our audience would find it boring, regardless if Jeff and I do.
Wow, thanks for selling me on the idea.
I'm just saying, we have new listeners all the time, and even the ones who are old listeners, they love hearing this stuff. They don't mind hearing it a second time. Jeff and I, on the other hand, like, Jesus.
You know what? I'm not telling the story yet.
Tell the story. I want to hear the story.
All right, damn it.
It's called stretching.
No. Bruce,
now that he knows how the internet works and other people can hear him, this is going to be great.
Yeah.
Bye,
Jeff,
DJ.
send me
Good
some
night.
of that Warbird coffee, please. I want some of the P-47. I love P-47s. You know that.
Yes, sir. Yes.
No,
sir.
but Bruce said, so the director's concerned that with all the shooting and killing that's been going on, we've got to give that scene more impact. We want we want to have your dad kill the Japanese soldier with a bayonet. What do you think about that? And I said, well, I don't like it because you're altering what he wrote with the old breed. And he said, well, will you talk to your mom and your brother? We want to know how the family feels. We really are concerned about that. And so I did, and they were opposed to it, but I voiced the strongest opinion because it just was altering what my dad wrote and with the old breed. And I said, look, I had this conversation with him as a kid. I asked him if he ever killed a Japanese soldier with a bayonet. And apart from the fact that as a mortarman, it's highly unlikely that would have happened, but it could have with night infiltrators and such. I remember him telling me, no, I never let one get close enough to me for that. We had the 45, we had the carbine, the Thompson, the M1 Garand, had some damn good weapons. I wasn't about to let that happen. So I knew that was just a complete fabrication. And so I told Bruce that. And he said, okay, well, duly noted. I'll tell the director. I think Tim Baden Patton was the director of that episode, or I could be wrong on that, but they passed that on, and so then they did change it a little bit to be the way it is. Layden takes grenade fragments and he's lying there, and Sledge is trying to tend to him as best he can, and then here comes the Japanese soldier out, and as we've seen it played out on film.
Well, I don't think it takes away. I mean, yes, obviously, it was a different island, but it was all part of the same campaign. It was just, if there was a coral reef that connected the two at lower tide, it would probably look like one island. It was so close together, right? I mean, it's Peleliu is just it's the strangest looking landmass I think I've ever seen to begin with. So, yeah, I mean, it's a little misleading for the viewers who just don't know. All the more important for people to read this stuff, right? Read these books.
Yeah,
and
good point.
I don't know if I thought it was interesting where your dad pointed out that it was the first time, or maybe the only time, that the aerial support was strictly from Marine aircraft.
I believe it was the first time. BMF 114. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that made me kind of think: is there any other time when there was an amphibious assault that was supported strictly by Marines in the air? I don't know. So that kind of makes that particular island, that little campaign within a campaign, that much more interesting. And I'll be honest, I don't know, is there any other mention besides your father or buddies of your father that even talk about, that put this island in the history book? Is there anything out there?
Probably not, because I mean, once they subsequently found out, and I had a great day on Ingusibus when I went to Peleliu in '99. Obviously going to the bunker with Eric Maylander, but ironically enough, they discovered after we took Ingusibus, it had no purpose at all because the sand was so soft that our fighters were a lot heavier, than Zero fighters. So Corsairs and Hellcats and TBS, TBMs couldn't use it. So it just sat there, I mean, I guess it did secure the area and keep Japanese from coming down from Kror and Babelthal for reinforcements. But I mean, apart from that, we were not able to use the airfield. But to your question, Jeff, I mean, that's a good question. I don't believe anyone has, because it just strategically is so microcosmic and so specific to Peleliu. But I mean, you're right. It's absolutely one of these shining examples of Marine close air support. BMF 114 just did a beautiful job.
Yeah, listening to your dad talk about how they were coming in, just screaming in, and multiple times where the guys were like, "Oh, he's not going to pull out in time," and then that Corsair does, and just being able to lay those accurate rounds down range, and that impressed me because I'm aware that the Corsairs were not a joy by any means for pilots to fly, and I think in some cases that's why they ended up in Marine squadrons, not because, give the Marines the junk, like people think, but no, it's just because they were going to be land-based, and that was just, they were more ideal to be able to land, on terra firma than to try to catch a hook and, rips the hook out, breaks landing gear, bent props, and then that thing's down. So it made sense to be more of a land-based aircraft, although the Royal Navy had success as a carrier fighter.
And they really kind of worked the bugs out on landing it on carriers.
Yeah.
I don't think Marines actually became carrier-based with the Corsair until early 45. I'd have to look it back up in Robert Sherrod's book, Marine Aviation in World War II, but I actually just reread that last year sometime. But, Marines didn't even get carrier-based with them until early 45, I think.
Well, and they would have been on a smaller carrier anyway, right?
Yep, they were.
Escort CVEs, yeah.
Yep,
so
CVEs.
That's another challenge in itself with an aircraft that had the largest diameter prop, I think, of any other fighter we use. So, but yeah, it was interesting. That was really cool. And again, not really didn't pick up on that the first time at all. You can't pick up on that watching the Pacific. So that was an interesting take, so that's where I'm at now. So obviously, like, I've been reading, it's very slow reading. I'm not in a hurry to get it done. I'm enjoying it when I have the time to read. So I'm not in any rush. So Don maybe asked me for the next 2 episodes, what you reading? I'm going to say the same thing.
Hey, I'm a slow reader too. I'm still reading. I'm staying with my boys, the biography of Jean Bazelon. Real quick, I want to change things up a little bit. It's been a long time coming. In the past, I've read a little bit of the information I was able to find out about my grandfather and his service. You guys basically know, he served in the ETO and he did grave registration. Can't really see it on this photo because it's got a frame. But in his wedding photo, on his left shoulder, you can make out the edge of a division patch. And I posted online, and people said, oh, that's the edge of the 15th Army, which I went out and got the patch, which is this.
Nice.
And I've had that for a while, and through some looking around, I did come across his registration card and his other card that he filled out. But the thing that got me a little befuddled was, looking up the 15th Army, they weren't activated until 1944. But my grandfather joined and signed up on February 16th, 1942. So I'm looking at this wedding photo, and I'm seeing this 15th Army. It's like, well, the 15th Army wasn't put together in 44, and he joined in 42. Who else did he serve with? Well, a few weeks back, my sister started sending me text messages, and there's some cool photos. I'm trying to get her to retake one. It's my grandfather, my grandma. My grandfather's in his uniform. They're at the dairy farm and in front of a fresh egg sign. And there's a couple of other ones with him in his uniform. But they sent me a newspaper clipping, and sadly, it's cut off in the wrong spot. And I'll explain to you why. And if anybody out there, I know we got some listeners who do some research. We're speculating that maybe my grandfather's material may have been burnt in the fire. But here's a newspaper clipping from the local newspaper that my grandmother cut upon his discharge, and has a picture of him in his uniform. It says PFC Preston C. Woods. And underneath it says PFC Preston C. Woods, husband of Mary Ann Maxwell Woods of Richwood, was honorably discharged from the U.S. Army on November at Atbury, Indiana. He served approximately 3 years of service, spending 2 years overseas in England, France, Belgium, and Germany with the 1st, the 3rd, and the 15th Army. So now I know who he served with before. Here's the thing I didn't know. PFC Woods wears the ETO ribbon with 2 battle stars, American Theater ribbon, Good Conduct ribbon, World War II Victory ribbon, and at the edge where it was cut, the Presidential Unit Citation, and then it cuts off. Like, my grandfather his unit got the President, Unit Citation. And, he's got all these awards and ribbons, and that's the most I've learned from him was this one little newspaper clipping that my sister sent me a photo of, because I can't find any of his information online. But luckily through that photo, I'm getting a little bit closer to trying to figure out his service, and it's kind of cool to see that he did serve, in fact, with the 1st, the 3rd, and the 15th Army.
That is cool.
So that's the current update on Mr. Preston Coleman Woods, my grandfather.
I wonder if his time in the 3rd Army was while under Patton.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking.
Be interesting to find out. So we're going to do something new here. We're going to wrap this part of the show up. I want to thank each and every one of you for your continued support. For those of you buying T-shirts, hats, mugs, we love you. And if you've already done so, fantastic. And if you haven't, but you want to support the show, you can do it in multiple ways. You can buy the aforementioned merchandise. That just gets our name out there to the people who view you at work or school or wherever you wear our gear at. That's a huge thank you. Simply watching us on YouTube helps. Go subscribe. You can watch our live stream. If you're like DJ Bowen and the others who have to turn in a little early, you can watch the replay. Just because it's not live doesn't mean it's not there. It's there from here until we run out of space and got to start deleting videos, which won't be anytime soon. Or you can sign up for Patreon. Lowest plan's $1 a month. If you sign up for that, we'll be perfectly happy. If you want to sign up for one of the other 2 plans, that's fantastic as well. Today, when we were doing a little early show recording, I posted a little behind-the-scenes video up on that. So if you guys are a Patreon member and you hadn't checked your email, there's a post up there today. And so we want to thank each and every one of you. And as per we said earlier, if you want to contact us, please email us at mailcall@WTSPWorldWar2.com. And so on behalf of myself, Henry, and Jeff, thank you guys so much. Now, for those of you on YouTube, stick around because we are going to try something we've never done here, and that is we are going to cut to some previously recorded content.
Really happy to be able to have a conversation with my good friend Saul David, prolific military historian and author of too many books to name right now, but most recently the one very close to my heart, Devil Dogs, King Company 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, from Guadalcanal to the shores of Japan. How are you doing, Saul?
Very good. Good to see you, Henry.
It's good to see you. So for our listeners, Saul and I were on a panel together at the International World War II Conference back in November, along with Richard Frank. And that was just a fantastic experience, a fantastic gathering of historians and authors. And it was just great to spend time with you there, Saul. How have you been doing since November?
Very good, actually. Yeah, no, came back, got straight into work, finishing off a proposal, and then getting a new book deal. So I'm energized, as you always are, Henry. Even after, 15, 16 books, the start of each new book, you're kind of full of, vim and vigor, and you think, great, can't wait to get out there.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah, what I wanted our conversation to be about, Saul, I don't want to pull you into, let's talk about Crucible of Hell, let's talk about Okinawa, let's talk about Devil Dogs. I mean, we can certainly touch on those things, but this is just a chance to have a laid-back conversation with you. I mean, I'm always interested in an author and historian's processes and how he does things and how he comes about what he's doing. What if you want to talk about your latest project? By all means, let's do that.
It's funny, actually. Funny you say that, Henry. I don't not want to talk about it, but the in-between book, the one that I'm not writing at the moment because it's already finished, but it hasn't been published, is a book called Sky Warriors about airborne in the Second World War. And it just so happened that I think I was talking about it a little bit too much, and maybe a coincidence, but someone else brought out a very similar book. Now, I'm not saying they heard what I was saying, but on social media, things get around. So I don't want to talk about the new one in any detail, if you don't mind. I'm very happy to talk about in general terms what it's about. And it's Tunisia in the Second World War, when the Americans first come into the European theater of operations and gain some combat experience. And of course, the Brits have been in North Africa for a long time with the 8th Army. And then the First Army comes in. The Americans form part of the First Army. And you get this really interesting moment in the Second World War where the British and the Americans are fighting side by side for the first time.
Well, I can't wait to see more about that and to respect your wishes on that. Let's respectfully step away from that, but I'm looking forward to it. I know our friend James Holland is probably that's one thing when I listen to James and Al, they talk about the Med a lot, and that's a theater of World War II that I need to do more reading on. I need to get his book Sicily because Don got me interested in Rogue Heroes. So I watched that, and I need to get Ben's book. But the Med is a theater I just don't know as much about as I do the Pacific. But
sadly, I think that's the way it is for a lot of, at least the American counterparts over here. We focus so much on the European theater and the PTO that a lot of us, I think out of all the living historians I know, only a small handful know anything about the Mediterranean operations.
Yeah, and well, funny enough, our blank spot, as we've discussed before, Henry, is the Pacific. When I say us, I mean the British historians and the British reading public.
Right.
The Mediterranean, we do know a fair bit more about, of course, because it's closer to us, but also it's where, as I just alluded to a second ago, it's where Montgomery begins to make his name. And Montgomery's one of the two big British generals of the Second World War, the other being, of course, Bill Slim, who's fighting in Burma. So Burma is really our Pacific theater in the sense that's where the major ground effort was going on as far as British and Commonwealth troops were concerned. But North Africa is very important too. And if you think that the war starts in Europe in 39, of course, there's the disastrous campaign in 39-40, and then there's nothing on the European mainland until 44. That gap in between is where we're making our big effort, and going back and forth, it's true, but eventually making inroads in North Africa. So in Britain's story of the Second World War, North Africa still looms quite large.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like have you done a book on the SAS?
SBS. So that's the maritime version of the SAS. Yeah. So the equivalent of you mentioned Rogue Heroes. The full title, of course, is SAS Rogue Heroes, and that was Ben McIntyre's authorized biography or authorized history, of the Special Air Service in the Second World War. Well, no one had done an authorized version of the SBS, the Special Boat Service, until I wrote my book. So it's a kind of twin companion. The two units, of course, go through joint selection together. I don't know how much you know about the formation of British Special Forces these days, but the recruits come from the same area, and then they make a decision to go one way or another. They either specialize in water or they specialize mainly in land, I suppose you would say, and that's the difference between the Special Boat Service and the Special Air Service.
So they actually let them make that decision at the soldier level, and it's not made for them based on their skills?
Yeah, they have it's really interesting. They all go in for joint selection, so they all go absolutely identical selection process, which, as far as I know, doesn't happen in the US. So the SEALs, for example, will have a totally separate to Delta, but we don't. That's not to say that they haven't already made up their minds as to where they want to go afterwards. They, generally speaking, they have. It is to say that the skill set, as far as the training and testing is concerned, is very similar. If you pass and are badged, that is, you become part of the official regular regiment or the service of either the SBS or the SAS. You then begin to specialize a little bit more. So the waterborne guys, the SBS, will then learn even more maritime skills, particularly maritime counterterrorism, which is one of their main jobs. And I don't know if you guys noticed, a couple of years ago there was a tanker heading towards the shores of the UK that was stormed by SBS troopers coming out of helicopters and also scaling up the sides of the tanker. And that's one of the very few occasions when the British public has seen the SBS in action, albeit it happened at night in quite difficult sea conditions. So not a lot was seen of it. But anyway, it made the papers. And it was quite amusing because officially our special forces don't exist. Yeah. They operate in a kind of and I don't think that's the case in America. And so all the newspapers had to report that this was a kind of military formation, but they couldn't exactly say what they were.
Yeah, it's kind of like our SEAL Team 6. They'll talk about vaguely their exploits, but they're like, well, they don't exist either. They're just a number, one of the different groups.
Yeah, exactly.
Saul, tell me, as I've gotten to know you, your areas of interest. I mean, I know World War II is a huge part of it, but talk to me a little bit about when you would go back to what got you interested in World War II. Was it just like, for me, it was always there for me, as we've talked about. Was it just kind of always there for you, or was there a particular aspect of it that you latched onto from a young age and then it just blossomed from there?
I think it was always there for me. My grandfather was a naval officer in the Second World War. He was actually on an armed merchantman. I was looking into the papers not that long ago on behalf of my father. I mean, because it's so close to me, I would never. I don't think I would specifically write about a relative. I like to keep a little bit of detachment. I know it's entirely different for you, Henry. The emotional connection to the book and your father's story is very different. And in any case, my father played a relatively minor role, but nevertheless, it was a very dramatic story. And the armed merchantman he was in charge of was called the Andania, which was pre-war was a very big passenger ship. Of course, they bolted guns to the decks and they used it for escorting convoys across the Atlantic. And it was during one of those convoys that it was sunk. He was the second in command, the XO, as you would say in the US parlance, and of course would have gone down with it if he hadn't managed to get off at the last minute. And then it was quite interesting. When I was looking at the papers, I discovered it in the National Archives, something called a court of inquiry. Now, you probably have a similar thing in the US Navy. If a ship goes down, there's effectively a court that has to decide on culpability, really. Right. I mean, it's a rubber stamping exercise. Yes, if they find people responsible and haven't done their job, they will make that point. But it's no sign of culpability because they're holding the court of inquiry. That's just what happens. And it was during the court of inquiry that there were a lot of complimentary remarks made about my grandfather. Now, I knew him very briefly towards the end of his life when, of course, he was old and grey, and it kind of, brought him, to life as a young man, I suppose, fighting in war in a pretty desperate situation. I mean, going down in the mid-Atlantic wasn't a good thing to be, particularly if it happened at night, which this did. So he easily could have perished in that action. My father was already alive, so it wouldn't have been the end of me in terms of my bloodline, but
right.
It does make you think. And that's what got me interested, I think. First flagged up the story of the Second World War to me. But also, just the last point on that, there were two pictures in my grandparents' house, so his house with my grandmother, and they were my grandmother's two brothers, both of whom were killed as junior officers, second lieutenants, in the First World War. So the thought of the conflict taking lives and the sacrifice that families had to give to both world wars was very much, I was very much aware of that growing up.
Plus, I would think with your age demographic, since the three of us are relatively close in age, and plus where you live, growing up, it had to have been still in the zeitgeist. It had still be, the visual impacts had still be there, opposed to our children, our grandchildren. Now it's so far away to them. But when we grew up, my grandfather served over in grave registration. We know Henry's father did. And so because of our age group and when we grew up, it was still relatively fresh, especially where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I suppose the proximity to the fierceness of the fighting in Europe and the closeness with which the Germans got to British shores, famously the Battle of Britain stopped them getting here. But, they're only 15, 20 miles away.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty chilling thought. Of course, there was a threat to the U.S. mainland. I'm not belittling that. But, if you'd had a huge and very potent Japanese force just 15, 20 miles away, it really would have made Americans think. It was bad enough what had happened, Pearl Harbor and various attacks on U.S. territories, of course. But yes, that proximity and that kind of understanding that it was a real knife edge in the summer of 1940 to us being occupied, and everything would have been different. Maybe we wouldn't have been speaking German, but it would have changed our whole way of life. And I think that was still very real in popular culture, in comic books, in films and in novels, and all forms of writing history and also fiction. So the Second World War loomed very, very large in my upbringing. And of course, having a personal connection to it, brought it that much closer. Having said all of that, I was just one Briton, of 50 or so million. It just so happened that I had a love of history too. So it took me in that direction eventually.
Yeah, it never occurred to me that if we were to take Japan and swap it out with Cuba and put them as close as Cuba is to Florida.
That's a good way to look at it.
Because I'm here in Florida, Cuba's 95 miles. Well, I'm on the other side, so 110 miles from me. So if we were to take Japan and swap with Cuba, that would be similar in feeling of how close they were and how, imminent danger could have been.
Yeah, there's a lot of controversy. Sorry, Henry. There's a lot of controversy about misguided in my view about Churchill and the role he played and whether or not he was racist and anti-imperialist and anti-Indian and but the reality for most of us living in the UK who remember that time, and certainly our parents and our grandparents who lived through it, was that without Churchill, we almost certainly would have done a deal which would have reduced us to sort of vassal state status. So for that reason alone, he will always play an enormously prominent role in our history. And any idea of, erasing him from the history books is complete nonsense in my view. But we won't get into the culture wars, I'm sure, in this discussion. But it does show you that, even now, someone as revered as him, who only 20 years ago was voted by popular vote, this is everyone in the country voting, I mean, the greatest Briton that had ever lived, and that he's now under attack. I mean, it's pretty shocking to think that that's the case just 20 years later.
Well, to use the word zeitgeist like Don used earlier, I mean, that Saul, that kind of is what's, like you said, we don't want to jump off into that right now, but that kind of thing is pervasive everywhere. Mm-hmm. But with Churchill, how could anybody even question that? You had to have someone of his character, his fortitude, his determination to steel everyone, to steel everyone's resolve to accomplish what had to be accomplished.
And some could possibly make the argument that if he wouldn't have had the great failures that he had suffered in the past, that the outcome could have been different because he knew what failures was. He didn't want to repeat that, and I'm sure he took a lot more thought and process when making big decisions, opposed to maybe what he had done 20 years earlier.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I suppose it's always a slight difference, the role of cabinet minister to prime minister, the top job, so to speak. But nevertheless, you're quite right, Don. I mean, his career is one of ups and downs. It's what makes the story so extraordinary, really. I mean, one of the youngest cabinet ministers at the start of the First World War, in a very important position, First Lord of the Admiralty, which is our Secretary of State for the Navy. And then, of course, becoming prime minister only at a moment of extreme crisis in the Second World War. And it's those few weeks immediately after that that are so interesting, because that is the point at which any right-thinking person must have imagined that the deal was done for the Brits. We'd been roundly defeated on the continent. We'd lost our only major ally at that time, which was France. And America wasn't looking like coming into the war anytime soon at that stage, and of course doesn't for another 18 months. So all logic might have told you the game was up and you've got to do a deal with Germany. And there were very important elements of both the cabinet and the political classes who felt that way. And looking back, you might have thought, well, I'm not surprised. But that sheer determination and doggedness to never give in. And of course, his famous speeches, which we don't need to repeat now. I mean, it's all well known. And although we can't assume that every Briton, as I've already pointed out, was thinking that, it does make us, I think, even now think, even in the early 21st century, think that was the best of the British character coming out at that point. We have shown the nastier side of our national characteristics in times in our history, but this was definitely an example of the best side coming out.
Well, that's what I was kind of wondering. It'd be interesting to hear the names that maybe armchair quarterbacks now could have said, well, this person was far more suitable to serve that role. Has any name throughout history been kind of put into that ring of, if so-and-so would have served instead of Churchill, the outcome would have been maybe expedited?
Well, you could possibly go back to some of the other major crises of existential crises of Britain's history to, without getting too esoteric about it, but I've written about all of these conflicts, Don, so I'll just reel off a couple. The War of the Spanish Succession, which is the war in which one of our greatest generals and military commanders, the Duke of Marlborough, fought a succession of astonishing victories against the French. And the context, of course, is that the French at that time were utterly dominant as a continental military power, and it was looking like they were going to dominate the continent. Even though we had a relatively powerful navy, it wasn't anything like as powerful as it became, and there was a real danger that if France dominates the continent, Britain gets snuffed out really as a growing power, and what of course becomes by the beginning of the 19th century the most dominant maritime power in the world, and retains that position of course until it's taken over by the US in the 20th century. So but I don't mean specifically Marlborough, actually. Interestingly enough, in that conflict, there was a guy called Godolphin, who is the chief minister back in the UK, played an absolutely key role in both supporting Marlborough and making it possible to fight a war on multiple fronts, because the War of the Spanish Succession, and I'm sure it's not a war that's familiar to that many US listeners, was a major global struggle. And then, of course, you get the next one, which is the 7 Years' War in the mid-century, which America, of course, is involved in, because it's the war fighting up in Canada. And it's the war that is a precursor and so interesting to what becomes the American War of Independence, because at this point, the American colonists are fighting on the side of the Brits against the French in Canada. And, we needn't go over that story again. But again, there was another kind of major political figure called William Pitt, the elder, in fact, not the younger. The younger is the famous politician of the Napoleonic Wars. So you've got those three characters, Godolphin, William Pitt the elder, and William Pitt the younger, all of whom I would say would be, in the frame for doing something pretty impressive, even in 1940, if you transported them through history. But I can't think of many others during that period. One or two interesting characters in the Victorian period, someone like Lord Palmerston, pretty impressive character, so possibly him too. But the frame for people who could have done what Churchill had done, and maybe even they wouldn't have pulled it off, is relatively small.
Even before World War II was even over, though, Saul, wasn't there some negative opinion that started to form about Churchill?
Yeah, I was reviewing Max Hastings' book about the relief of Malta, the siege of Malta, and the famous convoy that they took in to save it, really get enough supplies in to keep it going in the summer of 1942. And even prior to that operation, Churchill is incredibly unpopular, because if you move on from 1940, where, you know, he keeps us fighting, and you move on to the beginning of 1942 and the succession of disasters that overtook not just US arms, of course, in the Philippines and of course post Pearl Harbor, but also British arms, both in the Far East, the loss of Singapore, disaster in Malaya, but also a series of disasters taking place in other theaters, including Burma and the Middle East. So it just seemed to be one disaster after another. And there were movements in Parliament there were murmurings and the beginning of dissent that might have meant the beginning of the end for Churchill. And he himself, you know, that's not just me making that assessment. Churchill himself said that. He said, I'm getting very, very close to a possible removal from power. And it's hard to believe that, isn't it, when we know what happens next? And we also put it in the context of 1940. But just goes to show you're never entirely secure. And even Roosevelt, of course, is feeling a little bit jittery in 44, I think, leading up to his re-election. So, you know, and certainly for those of us outside the US, Roosevelt seems completely, unassailable politically. But clearly no one is.
Well, to bring it down to, say, a foxhole view, you know, I remember my father and I talking about, certainly, you know, there was this belief that when Roosevelt passed away in April of 45, that because my dad wrote about, you know, being on Okinawa and everybody hearing that, and I think he respected Roosevelt, but he did not have this just total respect for him without question, you know. And he always told me, he said, you know, you hear these popular stories that everyone was weeping in their foxholes. He says, I didn't see that. I mean, he said, yes, he was the only president many of us had ever known, but we were just trying to get the job in hand completed, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because that is very much amplified by the sort of cross section of opinion that I looked at when I was writing Crucible of Hell. So obviously your father's out in Okinawa at the time. And I was looking at the reaction of multiple different servicemen, you know, Navy, Army, and of course Marines. And there was a cross section. Some were saying, you know, disaster, woe is me. But I think more typical was your father's reaction, actually. And of course, you know, everyone has their own personal politics at the time. I mean, Roosevelt had been in for a long time. He was a Democrat. I'm not sort of going to, you know, we won't bring out the sort of political divides that even some of the, you know, the soldiers must have felt and some of the Marines must have felt. But obviously he wasn't everybody's cup of tea. And yet, just like Churchill, because Churchill is voted out of power very soon after the end of the Second World War, as both of you know. So, you know, you might have thought, well, you know, where's the gratitude for winning the war? Because as soon as the war's over, then, you know, we've got to get the country back on its feet. And the feeling was, well, the Labour Party, equivalent, I suppose, in some ways, slightly further to the left of the political spectrum than the Republican Party. So equivalent, I suppose, in some ways to the Democrats. You know, their best place to do this. Well, you, of course, already had a Democrat president. So, you know, maybe at some stage, inevitably, there was going to be a reaction to the Republicans. But it does go to show, doesn't it, that even an iconic figure like Churchill, you know, and arguably Roosevelt too, you know, are ideal for war, but maybe not necessarily for peace. I'm not sure that does work for Roosevelt, but that was always the feeling about Churchill.
It never really occurred to me until Henry just said that, but it makes sense that not so many of them would be that heartbroken per se, because, I mean, let's think about it. These guys are watching their own personal friends die by the day, and then they get the word that the president died. Well, that sucks, but I've been watching my friends die for the last year and a half, so I can definitely understand how some of them were a little shocked, but not torn apart as they like to romanticize in all the books about, oh, everybody was crying, it's the only president they ever known. I'm sure a lot of them were like, yeah, that sucks, but I'm trying to stay alive here.
Saul, you brought up. Oh, go ahead.
No, just one last point on that. I mean, Buckner's reaction was interesting because, you know, his main concern is that there was going to be, you know, so Buckner, of course, being the general in Okinawa, and who, you know, tragically gets killed at the end of the campaign, you know, the most senior U.S. commander to die in combat in the Second World War. I think there was one other lieutenant general who was killed too in France. But anyway, Buckner's reaction only a month or couple of months before he dies is, well, who's going to take over? Because, what do we know about this vice president? And that's the other thing to remember. We know what Truman did afterwards. We know about Truman and the bomb, and we know about Truman and the late 1940s, the beginning of the Cold War. And in many ways, history's been very kind to Truman, and maybe deservedly so. But at that moment in history, in 45, we freeze frame that specific moment, people didn't know who he was.
Nope.
So Buckner's main concern is, who is this guy? And is he capable of leading a nation in war? And more importantly, is he capable of supporting the servicemen to do the job that we need to do? So that was his main concern, I think, rather than, shock and horror that the head of the military has lost his life.
Yep.
To speak about, because you brought up Crucible of Hell, and I'm glad you did, because I read that last summer. I'm going to reread it because I want to shore up. I mean, my knowledge on Okinawa is pretty good. That's the portion of my manuscript I just am finishing up as I get to the end of my rough draft. And I love Crucible of Hell, and so I'm looking forward to rereading it. But what led you? Because I just looked at a list of all the books you've written, and it covers a panoply of historical eras, as you just said yourself. But what led you to Okinawa? I know we've talked about K Company, what led you to K-35 and Devil Dogs, but Crucible of Hell, can you tell me about the formative process when you became interested enough on that battle to say, okay, I'm going to do my own book on Okinawa?
I can, Henry, and it's reasonably straightforward, actually. So I review a lot of books. I find it really interesting. I get to read a lot of military history anyway,
Sure.
But reviewing forces me to get through stuff quite quickly, keeps me up to date with all the new stuff. And this is the cynical bit of the decision to be a reviewer, it makes it very likely that those national newspapers that I review for, the Daily Telegraph, the Times of London, are going to review my own book. So in any case, I was reviewing a biography, very good biography of Truman. I just mentioned Truman a second ago, and it was really striking that the first chapter of that book talks about him getting the news that Roosevelt's dead. He's got to take over. He didn't know about the atomic weapons program. He knew that they were fighting in Okinawa because they'd invaded 9 days earlier. But all of a sudden now he's got to take charge of, one of the greatest battles that American forces have ever fought, certainly the largest naval operation they've ever fought. And he's got zero experience. And it suddenly made me realize, hold on a second, the Battle of Okinawa, it takes place at a really important moment in history, which is the war in Europe's ending, but it is no way is it even vaguely close to ending in the Pacific, but for, of course, what happens next. But nobody in April the 10th, or was it April the 12th, I think, when Roosevelt dies, April the 12th, nobody at that stage, of course, even knows if the atomic weapons are going to work. So the assumption is, and this is what got me thinking about Okinawa as such an important battle, the assumption is that Okinawa is just a stepping stone to the next bit of the fight, which, of course, is going to be the Japanese mainland. And so which you have to do as a historian, take yourself into the minds of the guys as they are at the time, rather than what happens next.
Sure.
It then becomes a much, much more interesting battle. Not just the last great battle of the Second World War, but the battle which materially, in my view, and I make this argument, as you know, Henry, at the end of the book, affects the way both the politicians and the senior commanders are thinking about the possibility of the use of atomic weapons. And I'm sure we don't need to go into the debate in this program, but it for anyone who imagines that there is absolutely no justification for using atomic weapons, they need to read that book, or at least they need to read a book about Okinawa and what your father went through to understand why he made the point at the end of his wonderful book With the Old Breed. I felt like I'd been reborn. I mean, I can't remember if those were exact words. And, in some ways he was kind of shocked that the war had ended. But in no way did he have anything other than approval for the use of nuclear weapons. And, all the other servicemen out there were thinking the same thing.
Did you, in your research process for Crucible of Hell, did you go to Okinawa? Because I've been to Peleliu. You and James and I talked about that, and I know James, we ought to get a trip to Peleliu, which I would love, by the way. But did you go to Okinawa? I've never been.
Yeah, I did. And I would love to go to Peleliu, as you know, Henry. But I did go to Okinawa. it's actually relatively easy to get to compared to some of the other islands, Peleliu included, and Guadalcanal and New Britain, because it's relatively close to the Japanese mainland, 300 or 400 miles south of the most southerly island, Kyoto, and so there are two things I'd say about visiting it. You know, in an ideal world, anyone writing about any conflict would always go and visit it. And I'm about to do a trip out to Tunisia soon, just going back to that story. But the slight disappointment with Okinawa is that while in places you very much get a sense of the terrain and the coral rock, and the main bit of the fighting, which took place in the center of the island, has been much built over now because Naha, the capital, has expanded hugely. So it's you're really looking at the battlefield through an urban landscape, and that takes a certain amount of imagination, and it takes a lot of wandering around with maps and pictures of how it was and trying to make out some of the features. Having said all of that, some of the famous features are still there, and they're still very visible. Sugarloaf Hill is not there, where the 6th Marine Division, of course, gets cut to pieces. But Hacksaw Ridge is still there, and some of the other major features. And particularly when you go to the south of the island, where the Japanese made their last stand, and also when you go to the north of the island, where the 6th Marine Division first moved up with the 1st Marine Division in support, you get a proper sense. Yeah, exactly. Motobu Peninsula. You get a proper sense of the terrain and the climate and what it must have been like at that time. Closer to what was known as the main battle line, the main defensive position for the Japanese, it's much more difficult to get a proper sense of that. But having said all of that, it's still worth going to see. And there's a guy there who took me around, whose name slips my memory for a second, but it's in the back of the book. I thank him in the back of Hell, but he showed me around. He's an ex-US serviceman who still lives on the island, and he runs the museum there, the Okinawa Museum, military museum, and it's fascinating to see. And of course, he knows all the locations. So if you ever do go, Henry, I would recommend you get him to show you around.
And that I would certainly do. One of the great things about the technology we have today is, you both know this,
Drone
Google
footage.
Earth. Do what?
And drone footage. There's a lot of videos on YouTube now.
But Google Earth, I mean, so Saul, when I read Crucible of Hell, when I reread my dad's book, going through on my own project, a location that's just burned into my brain is Half Moon Hill. Which of course was one of the anchors of the pre-Shuri defensive line, I guess. Am I saying that correctly? Would you agree?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, that was. I was trying to remember the what did I call it? The main battle line, but the Shuri defense line, exactly.
Shuri defense line, and I think so. Sugarloaf was more, I believe, further to the west, and Half Moon was more to the east. But my dad saw more action. Well, 6th Marine Division was Sugarloaf, of course, but Half Moon Hill, he wrote of so eloquently. And I look it up on Google Earth, and it's like the backyard of somebody's condo. It's so heavily built up around there. And you look at I've looked at Sugarloaf Hill, and it's like there's a coliseum there. And I think there's like a viewing. I don't even know a viewing stand of some sort. You
plaque.
Yeah, a plaque on a stand, and you can walk up these steps under an awning, and of course, most of the signage is going to be in Japanese, but it seems like there are a lot of, particularly around the Shuri area, which obviously Shuri Castle is there, and it's a hugely visited tourist attraction, I guess. But there are a lot of like walking parks and things like that with little stone monuments and little signs and things like that, and cave entrances, but. I mean, I still want to go there, but it's nothing like going to Guadalcanal or going to Peleliu.
Well, that's like we were talking about a few weeks back. Part of being a historian is like you don't want to wish countries progress and production and development, but there's part of you is like, leave it alone. But especially on small islands like that, they can't leave it alone or they would have nowhere to spread out to. So that's the hard part about being a historian and wanting to see those battlefields, especially down there. It's like, okay, I get it. You got to expand and provide housing and development for your population, but it's hard sometimes when you see that stuff.
Yeah, as I say, it's an unfortunate sort of collision between the geography of where the battle was fought in 1945 and the fact that Naha City, the main kind of urban area, was so close to that. Naha, of course, being just across from Shuri. So, but yeah, Don's absolutely right. Interestingly enough, we've got something going on in the UK at the moment that James is heavily involved with, and I and a number of other reasonably high-profile historians have all signed a letter to try and stop the government from redeveloping Scampton Airfield, which was the airfield that's gone into, mythical history in British Second World War history, because, of course, it's where the Dambusters raid originated from, where 617 Squadron was based. And they're about to redevelop that and turn it into a refugee center. So people are up in arms about this, and it's absolute utter madness, because the original buildings are still there, and there's also an alternative plan to redevelop and get some kind of aeronautical and engineering hub going there that could actually provide a bit of money and jobs for the people of Lincolnshire, which is one of the relatively poorer areas of the United Kingdom. So, but anyway, I mentioned that as an example of history that can be erased for the sake of progress, in inverted commas. But I think there are very strong counter arguments against that happening in this particular case.
I think Peleliu is certainly in 1999, it was pretty virginal. Very little development. There was a little bit. I remember I stayed at a place called the Storyboard, and it was basically a series of bungalow cottages. There's been more development since, obviously, but I still think it's got to be the closest approximation.
Yeah.
Not if you compare to like Cape Gloucester. I mean, Cape Gloucester, I've looked at that on Google Earth, and there's hardly anything to look at because it's just undeveloped jungle. But and Peleliu does have its own population, and of course up in the northern Palau Islands you got Koror and Babelthorpe. But still, even with what they've done, I think it's just such a beautiful approximation of a preserved battlefield, if you will.
Yeah, if you look like Guadalcanal from some of the drone videos they're doing down there, it's on YouTube. It's like Samalunga River and Alligator Creek are just going through people's backyards, like right where it spills out, where the sandbar was. It's just now you just see houses all through there. Granted, they're smaller houses, but yeah, a lot of that area has been developed. And once again, you're like, it sucks for historian purposes, but those people need places to live, and they're the ones living there now.
Do you think, Saul? Do you think that there's still room for more to be done? Because I know so many books have been written about Peleliu. Like we were on the We Happy Few podcast here several weeks ago with Dick Kemp, who wrote Last Man Standing. Now, obviously, that focused just on the First Marines, but when I go back to my formative years, my father was talking about how Peleliu was a forgotten battle back in the 80s, and I know we've had this conversation before, but certainly now I think it's one of the better known battles. I don't think it'll ever have household status like Iwo Jima, or Pearl Harbor, but I think it has certainly been written about prolifically. I mean, do you think there's still room for more to be done on that battle?
Well, I mean, as a historian, I like to think that there is room for a new book on almost any subject every 5 or 10 years. And the reason, of course, is that new material's coming up all the time. It still is, even from the Second World War. But more importantly than that, it's a kind of reassessment of the story. And excuse me, and that's really how history works, Henry. Sorry. Just get the frog out of my throat.
Well, it almost comes down to replenishing. It almost comes down to replenishing stock as well, especially when it comes to new books. And as time goes by, the older books come off the shelves. They maybe get pushed back or taken off the shelves, and even the library or on Amazon, wherever. And so, by putting out new books of the same content, even if it has newer content in which that context resides, it's one way of keeping that war, that those people's minds fresh. And to Henry, you may not realize this, but as far as Peleliu goes, especially anybody who was a big video game fan in the mid-2000s when World at War came along, when you're playing Call of Duty, you're running across the airfield. You're actually taking over. You can see the bunkhouse where the Japanese are laying up, and so you actually play on Peleliu Island on one of the campaigns on that game. So there's a generation of people who are in their 30s and early 40s now who they may not realize Peleliu from the aspect of the book and the series, but they know the name because they ran across it several thousand times while playing Call of Duty for 8 hours a day through the mid-2000s. So,
well, and I'm not much of a video gamer, but I mean, yeah, that does. I mean, I know, Saul, you're friends with Paul Woodadge. I know Woody and I've had this conversation. What do you do to make young people coming up have an interest in this kind of history? And video games are a medium to do that.
Yeah, and it's I was contacted not that long ago and said, would I assist in the making of a new video game? I mean, and this never went anywhere, but the fact that they were contacting me as a historian, particularly of the Second World War, and asking if I would assist in the the sort of historical accuracy of video games tells you that they realize the market's very big to get the historical authenticity. And I would be absolutely up for that. I mean, I said I was at the time, because if I can find any way to get people interested in history, whether they want to read it as fiction, non-fiction, want to watch documentaries, want to listen to podcasts, or even want a game and get a little bit of history out of it, it's all grist to the mill for me, I feel. And as historians, we should be as adaptable as possible. I mean, some historians always are very kind of snooty about certain the UK term snooty, kind of like a bit snobby about certain forms of media. But I'm not at all. From when I started out as a freelance historian to going on to do a PhD and a bit of teaching, but really always thinking of myself as a writer of good narrative history first and foremost. I was very open to the idea that you would use multimedia to get the message across, because we can see what's going on in Ukraine. I don't want to dwell on that too much. Henry, I'm doing a podcast on it at the moment, and it's grim. If you think the stories of Peleliu are bad, well, they are bad. But there's some bad stuff coming out of Russia, and the reason history is important is because Russians need to understand their history, not the completely bowdlerized version that they've got from Putin. The real story of history, the Ukrainians too. And it's not going to stop wars being fought, but it might make people think a little bit more about the need to invade your neighbor, for example. It's really hard for us to get our heads around in the 21st century that's happening in Europe, on the fringes of Eastern Europe. So yeah, important. History is important. We all three of us, I know, agree on that. So it's a question of how you spread the word, and the more forms of media that you can do that, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Not to dwell on a 10-year-old game, but the nice thing about the campaign mode is they actually had Kiefer Sutherland doing the narration, and in between missions they would have real, historical clips, and he would explain about the mud and Cape Gloucester and fighting against the weather and the illness. And so in between each level, they actually injected history into it, and the very first level of the match, you're on Making the Toll, and then it just goes through the history, and they also include the Russians' contribution to the war as well. But, we've used to say this quite a bit on this podcast. It's been a while, and you truly don't hear it that much. When I was growing up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was learn from history or you're bound to repeat it. Somewhere in the mid-2000s, it's like, well, let's erase history, forget it ever happened, and then things, as you were saying, the Ukrainians, the Russians, they need to learn their true history to help maybe prevent some of this stuff in the future. But here we are running in circles.
It seems like, it feels like that. I mean, you brought up the point a little while ago. We spoke a few minutes ago about there's always new material coming out. I mean, if you are a historian who tends to focus on the Eastern Front, which when I was growing up, that was an aspect of it. I mean, obviously the Pacific, but the Soviet-German War, as it's properly called, that just interested me almost more than anything. And of course, Russia was so closed when coming up through the 80s as I did, and then things opened up, and it seemed there were more archival material. I think there's a historian who's been on Woody's show, Saul. I think it's David Stahl, I think is his name, who's written prolifically on the Eastern Front, and Prit Buttar also, and I'm sure for them, they feel like it's such a fluid situation on what is available, because there was, I think, an opening up of archives for a period of time, and they were able to have access to new information. But now I guess things have kind of tightened back up, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. They absolutely have. And that says everything, I'm afraid, because when you have an authoritarian regime that wants to keep control of its history, the first thing they do is stop historians, particularly foreign historians, getting in and seeing the crucial archives. And the reason this is particularly alarming as far as the story of the Eastern Front is concerned, quite apart from the rest of Russian history, is because most of the German archives, as I'm sure both of you know, were destroyed in the bombing. So, yeah, there are military archives in Freiburg, in southern Germany. I've been to see them for one of my previous books, but they are so there are so many holes in them. When you think of the wonderful resource we have both in the UK and the US. I mean, I've done some, I'm coming to the States, as Henry knows, for research in the not too distant future. And I've been there many times to the National Archives. It's just a wonderful resource. It's quite difficult to pin down what you want to get before you go there. But once you're there and you're talking to the archivists, I mean, really, the depth of information, particularly in the story of the Americans in the Second World War, is second to none. It's absolutely astonishing. And the Germans simply don't have that, and the Russians aren't letting you see it. So in the end, if you're a historian of the Eastern Front, I would be thinking about maybe moving into another area. I mean, I'm joking aside, because obviously a lot of material is already out there and they can rework a lot of that. But the idea that you're going to find something new in the archives anymore, given the circumstances of the Russians' situation at the moment, is really alarming. I mean, Sir Anthony Beaver has gone on the record, as I'm sure both of you know, saying, well, I wouldn't be allowed to write Stalingrad now. And in any case, he's persona non grata in Russia today because of his very justified conclusions about what the Russians did going into, and he's not the only one who's written that, of course, going into Berlin in 45 and the way they behaved. And of course, we can see it happening again. So if anyone's in any doubt as to what the Russians are capable of doing, they only need to see what's going on in Ukraine. Of course, there are as many people denying what's going on as there are, right-minded people reporting it. But we do, fortunately, in the West, still have a very good and responsible press corps, both in America and in the UK, who are opening our eyes to what's going on. And we're following this very closely in my podcast.
Certainly.
So I want to say thank you for coming on the show today. Before we wrap things up, do you have any plugs you want to get out there or tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, just to say a couple of things. My podcast is called Battleground Ukraine, and that can be found on all podcast channels and wherever you get your podcast. And to say that my last book, Devil Dogs, is coming out in paperback in both the States and the UK later this year.
Henry, do you got anything coming down the pike?
No, I know you need to wrap it up, and Saul's busy. And Saul, we so much appreciate you taking your time to come on and spend some time with us.
Thanks so much, Henry. And last thing from me, very excited to know that you're working on an expanded version of your dad's book, your own piece of work, of course, and also the possibility, I'm sure you've mentioned it on the podcast before, that there may be a reissuing of With the Old Breed with the unexpurgated, extra material that was never used originally. I don't. Maybe I shouldn't be saying that. Maybe you want to cut that out.
That's an exclusive. I haven't heard
that's
that.
Okay. I mean, it's look. If I had all day, every day to work on this, I think it was more on that later. But I'm sorry. We're on Don's lunch hour, so we've got to.
No worries.
Sorry about that.
It's all good.
It's fine, really.
I want to thank everybody for their continued support, and if you want to continue to support the show, please head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com. That's WWII.com, and click on the Patreon link. Like, subscribe. It's only $1 a month. It goes a long way to help do things that we're doing here. And once again, Saul, thank you. For myself, Jeff Copsetta, Henry Sledge, we will talk to you all next week. Cool, guys. I appreciate it so much. Sorry I had to cut it short, but yeah, I'm at work in my